Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smaulgld speculation series. Today we revisit yesterday's news where the SEC said that ICOs may be subject to US securities laws. That was the big headline yesterday, and that made people say that the SEC is now cracking down on ICOs. Well, we're going to take another look at that today. The SEC offered a very Comeyesque explanation as to why it took no action against the DAO's ICO. They laid out the case against the decentralized autonomous organization's initial coin offering and then declined to act. The SEC labeled the DAO tokens as securities that would by law require them to be registered, but they weren't. The SEC used its findings, however, instead to use the DAO example as a teachable moment to warn the ICO industry. So the SEC laid out the case, did nothing, just warned the industry. So some of the headlines that we saw yesterday were talking about how the SEC noted and made a determination that the DAO tokens were securities, and that was big news and potentially big trouble for ICOs. And the SEC noted that those who offer and sell securities, like the DAO tokens, in the United States must comply with the federal securities laws, including the requirement to register with the commission or to qualify for an exemption from registration requirements of the federal securities law. Now, yesterday we went through what's entailed in filing a registration statement. It's a long, expensive process. Now, just because this is nothing new, that language that the SEC mentioned yesterday, that if you sell securities, you got to comply with the securities law, you got to register them, that is nothing more. That is not a tough new stance the SEC is taking against ICOs. That's their stance. That is the law for anyone in any industry who wants to issue a security. It is just a restatement of the facts. So, just because the SEC hasn't brought a case against a ICO token for being unregistered doesn't mean that it's not a security. It just means the SEC hasn't taken enforcement action, hasn't looked at it yet, but the law is still the law. But what's intriguing here is the SEC did take a look at the DAO's token, and they did determine that they were securities. So this isn't hypothetical. That law always exists. Whether they enforce it is a different issue. But here's the interesting thing about yesterday's report. Not that they deemed it a security, is that they deemed it a security, deemed that there was an issue, and did nothing. Here's what they said in the report. There's a link here, right there. DAO tokens are securities. You can't get any clearer than that. And they lay out, and you don't even need to know the legal reasonings, but here are the 4 reasons that they're saying the foundational principles of securities laws apply to virtual organizations or capital raising entities using distributed ledger technology. That's a lot of mumbo jumbo for saying that digital tokens, ICOs, are subject to US securities laws. End of story. Okay, they're saying that. That's their broad statement. And then they go through, well, investors invest money, they expect a profit, and they get it because there's managers, other people managing to help them make their profit. Therefore, it's a security. Okay. Well, if that's the case, and that's the determination the SEC's made, it's an open shut case. The DAO issued securities, and as such, the SEC also noted in the report, if you issue securities, you must register offers and sales of securities unless there's a valid exemption available. So, the SEC says these tokens were securities. They were supposed to be registered, but they didn't. And so, having laid out this case in a report that the DAO tokens were securities and that they weren't registered, here's what they said. In light of the facts and circumstances, the agency has decided not to bring charges in the instance or make findings of violations in the report, but rather to caution the industry and market participants. First of all, I want to know what are the facts and circumstances, why they would decide not to bring charges. It looks like the DAO issued securities without an exemption. And then it said they didn't make a finding of a violation. Sure they did. They clearly said that the DAO tokens are securities And they repeated the law that if you issue securities, they have to be registered. Instead, they said, well, we're going to use this opportunity to caution market participants. Against what? Telling them that there's a law, that if you issue securities, they got to be registered. That law has been around since 1933. Now, all you have to do is reread the SEC report. They clearly made a finding of a violation. Now, whether they chose to enforce it, that's a different story. But they said there's securities, the DAO issued securities, they were required to be registered, and they weren't registered. So I'm still and they gave no reason other than, in light of the facts and circumstances, they're not going to bring charges in this instance. Then why even look at the case? See, they're not, the purpose of the SEC, yes, you can issue they have done in the past, and it makes sense for them to do this from time to time. They can issue a paper explaining why they think a certain thing or certain activity in the market, participants need to take certain care, participants need to think about certain things, or they may issue a policy statement. But here what they did was they used a particular case, laid out the case against the DAO, and then took no action. That reminds me of Comey on Clinton. He followed a path very similar to the one the SEC trotted yesterday. In that investigation, the FBI investigation of Hillary Clinton's private email server in her official capacity as Secretary of State, James Comey held a press conference. He issued a statement which he read, and he enumerated all the times Hillary Clinton mishandled classified information. And his conclusion was very similar to what the SEC concluded yesterday. Basically, that we're not going to bring a case here on these facts, and the facts all indicate that this is clearly where he would bring a case. And he says that all cases that were prosecuted in the past involve some combination of clearly intentional or willful mishandling of classified information or vast quantities of materials exposed in such a way as to support an inference of intentional misconduct. And basically, we don't see that here. Even though in his statement, he explained everything that he did just see there, that any reasonable person will hear, oh, she did all these things, and you're going to now add this element of intent, and then you're going to say she didn't mean it, so never mind. But here's where it gets very eerily similar. Comey then said, look, let's be clear. This isn't to suggest that in similar circumstances, a person who's engaged in this activity would face no consequences. To the contrary, those individuals are often subject to security or administrative sanctions, but not Hillary. But that's not what we're deciding now. So basically, he used Hillary Clinton's investigation rather than to make a finding or to make charges against her, basically to warn others that don't do what she did. And it seems that the SEC is doing the same thing here. Look, whatever the DAO did, don't do what they did. The difference here, though, is I believe that if there really was a case, and you got to put politics aside with the Comey thing, so let's not even get involved in that. With the DAO, I think what the SEC was concerned about was they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to make a finding, but not a finding. They wanted to say the DAO was issuing securities, and therefore if they issued securities, they need to register them. But they weren't willing to bring the case. And the reason they weren't willing to bring the case was that if they brought the case and they lost, that would inspire other ICOs to structure their ICOs exactly how the DAO did theirs. And in that case, if a court found that if the SEC brought the charges against the DAO and they lost that case, then you would just see tons of ICOs coming out structured just like the DAO tokens, and therefore the SEC, they could avoid SEC oversight, because if it's not a security the way they structure it, then the SEC is not involved. Here's the problem with the SEC not being involved. It's a money issue. Here's what we wrote yesterday. ICOs are a threat to Silicon Valley and Wall Street. The initial public offering process is a cash cow for Silicon Valley, VC firms, and for Wall Street bankers and lawyers. They control the companies that go public, and they get vast amounts of money registering these companies, selling the companies, trading the securities on Wall Street. Unregulated ICOs are an existential threat to the IPO market because they bypass Silicon Valley and Wall Street completely. So what the SEC is trying to do here is protect the idea that they can corral everything under one umbrella so that the Silicon Valley and Wall Street firms can continue to run this game, because only large entities like Wall Street, big banks, and Silicon Valley firms can actually afford the process of taking a company public. And if you're a company, you're beholden to the Wall Street firms, because you can't do if you can do an ICO yourself, you can avoid all the lawyer fees, you can avoid, not all the lawyer fees, but you can avoid all the registration fees and all the banker fees, and you go straight to the public and you raise your capital that way. Well, the Silicon Valley and Wall Street are gatekeepers, and they make a fortune keeping that gate secure, subject to only when they allow a company to go through it, and of course they need to take their fee. And if the SEC were to have brought a case against the DAO and lost it, well, then it would be very hard for the SEC ever to gain back that control. So what they did instead was they said, look, if we say it's a security, look, we're the experts on what a security is. It's a security. So that's a warning to the people that want to do ICOs. What they're trying to do, I believe, is they're trying to lobby Congress at some point for the right to regulate ICOs. They may need separate legislation if they need it. That's probably what they're going to get. I don't think they want to litigate the definition of security as it's written today and lose. I think what they rather do is maybe the way they get that added authority is just change the definition of security to include all manners of these ICOs, and now it comes under SEC purview. Well, once it comes under SEC purview, well, then the banks and the venture capitalists are back in charge, because they will bring these companies public. Their lawyers will bring these companies public. The ICO process, where you just put up a website, write a white paper, get a couple of people on YouTube to promote it, those days would be over. So it appears that the SEC doesn't want to stop innovation in the crypto space. If they did, they would have just shut this one down and said, look, you can't do it. And that would have a real chilling effect on the ICOs. They want this to happen, but I believe they want it to happen with the assistance and oversight from them of the Wall Street banks and the Silicon Valley venture capitalist firms. That's a dual-edged sword. The upside to that is much more money will be coming into the sector if it is run by the big Wall Street banks and the Silicon Valley firms, just because there is a larger number of investors that are comfortable with that process. And so we'll see. I want to know what you think, why the SEC chose not to bring an enforcement action against what looked to be a very clear case of a violation of security laws by the DOA. Thank you very much.